Hello, everyone. So we did our country presentation on Cuba. On the left, you can see that Cuba is situated between the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. It is the largest island in the Caribbean, and it is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. On the right, you can see that the capital city of Cuba is Havana, and Havana makes up one of 15 provinces that the island of Cuba is divided into. The highest peak in Cuba is Pico Turquino at an elevation of 6,476 feet. Now time for some history. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, Cuba was inhabited by the Guanahatabe people in the west and the Taino people in the east, as is shown on the map. Christopher Columbus landed on the north coast of Cuba in 1492, as I just explained. The island was mapped in 1509 by Sebastian de Ocampo. In 1511, Diego Vasquez founds Baracoa, the first Spanish settlement in Cuba. He goes on to conquer the entire island. The picture on the right is what Baracoa looks like today. And from then on, Spain controls Cuba for centuries. From 1868 to 1878, the First Cuban War of Independence takes place. It ends when Spain agrees to make changes in government. Then in 1985, a revolution starts up again, led by Maximo Gomez. The United States allies with Cuba during the Spanish-American War. Cuba and the United States win the wars, and the United States becomes a protectorate of Cuba in 1898. There's a picture of Maximo Gomez on the right. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista rules Cuba in the form of a corrupt dictatorship. A year later, Fidel Castro begins leading a revolution against Batista. Castro becomes prime minister in 1959 with the help of Che Guevara. Che Guevara is on the right in that picture, and Fidel Castro is on the left. Then in 1960, Cuba allies with the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis takes place soon after that in 1962. And then in 2008, Castro retires and passes on the presidency to his brother Raul. In 2011, Cuba passes the right for individuals to own property.
Cuba has a really rich culture, which is a mixture of African, Caribbean, and Spanish customs. And some of this includes their music and dance, which includes rumba, salsa, bolero, and their national anthem is La Bayamesa. And some of their food includes moros y cristianos, which is black beans and rice, ajicao, which is stew with meat and vegetables, lechon asado, which is shown on the right, which is roasted pig, and tamales and ropa vieja, which is skirt steak in the tomato paste. And their breakfast times are pretty early compared to some Latin countries, and they're similar to ours in the US. And their major sport is baseball, but others that they excel in are volleyball and track and field. Their major dance is the salsa dance, which came to Eastern Cuba through African slaves traded there, and it's a combination of African and Cuban music. The traditional drumming is common in African music and ceremonies, and the dance is a combination of danzón, which is from French and Haitian immigrants, rumba from African slaves, and son, which is a type of Cuban dance. And the dance is all about lower body movements and swinging the hips with many back and forth steps. Their big sport, baseball, has produced some of the world's greatest players. And it was introduced to Cuba in 1864 when some Cuban students visited the US and came back with a ball and a bat and spread the sport. And over time, there have been 381 Major League Baseball players who have come from Cuba and 27 at the current moment. The Cuban government created their own professional baseball league to try to keep some of their players at home instead of them leaving to the US. And the MLB's White Sox success is reliant on their Cuban players.
All right, now we're going to be discussing the challenges Cuba is facing today. The first one we're going to be discussing is economic crisis. This actually deepened during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the medical shortage. Many were not having the access to medical needs, as well the country energy source, which included blackouts, and this included rise in poverty and inequality. There also was travel restrictions, especially during the pandemic. Authorities can deny in and out of access of Cuba, and this restricted travel for many. Now, moving forward to political prisoners, Cubans who were criticized the government were risk of prosecution, and this lead them to go into prison. And the prison conditions weren't well; they were overcrowded. And if you were to criticize the government, you were beaten or risk not getting medical attention or not meeting your family. Next is freedom of expression. So the government controls media in Cuba and publish critical information. If anyone, like journalists, would publish anything about Cuba, they were harassed from authorities. And then many websites were blocked as well. Moving forward to the next slide. Now the people of Cuba. So Cuba is a nationality and not an ethnicity. The Caribbean island is populated with about 11 million people. The four main ethnic groups in Cuba are white Cuban, mixed, Maluto or mestizo, and Afro-Cuban, and there are also minority groups such as Asians. Moving forward. So the Cuban values and tradition. So Cuba culture is rich of African, Spanish, and Caribbean pastime. The food, the religion, and the music and dance combine all elements of old world and new. So some of the tradition are the Cuban cigars. So individuals in Cuba like to take the time to smoke cigars with family and enjoy their moments. And baseball is king, as we discussed earlier. It's very popular. And dancing as well, such as salsa, rumba, and mambo and eat. In Cuba, they like to do with a little bit of food, they like to make delicious meals. And in one of their New Year's tradition is getting a bucket of dirty water and throwing it outside the window, symbolizing throwing out the bad memories and creating good new ones. Some of the values are from their national hero, Jose Marti. And some of their another value is human dignity. So this is personal, cultural, and national identity and patriotism Cubans have. And then right there at the end, we have a quote that I really admire from Jose Marti is the only way to be free is to be educated. And I really admire this quote because everybody deserves access to education. Moving forward. So the study question we have for you guys is how does the political history of Cuba compare to that of other Latin American countries? And how is it similar or different? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.